It follows from Herod the Great after his death in 4 BC, that his kingdom was split up between his sons. And so this is why we have tetrarchs. So tetrarchs are rulers of these different provinces. And so initially there was a Archelaus was tetrarch over this area around Judah and Jerusalem. Herod was tetrarch of Galilee in purple, and Philip is tetrarch of Iturea, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene. So what then happens is that there's a rebellion in the area of Archelaus's kingdom in around Judea, and the Romans come and crush it and put in place and make it a Roman province and put in place their own government. And so that's how we come to have a governor of Judea, and that is Pontius Pilate at this time, and Herod is the tetrarch of Galilee. And so these are two of the key figures we're going to consider this evening. One sort of directly under Roman rule over Judea, and Herod sort of less directly ruling over the Galilee region. And the administrative capital of this area in Judea is Caesarea Maritima, and so Pilate would have spent most of his time there and then come up to Jerusalem at key occasions such as the Feast of the Passover. And it's in Caesarea Maritima where this archaeological item was found. This is the Pilate stone, which has on it an inscription of Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. And so this reminds us that what we're talking about was all real historical events that took place. These are real people and real things that they did. What else do we know about Pilate? Well, we're not told much about him apart from when we come across the trial, but we do have this comment in Luke 13 that there is this rebellion, and the Galileans we're told that their blood, Pilate, mingled with their sacrifices. And so perhaps we get an impression of Pilate as quite a ruthless Roman governor, trying to put fear into the population and trying to avoid the rebellions that brought the end of his predecessor's kingdom. So that's Pilate. Then there's Herod. As we said, he's the tetrarch of Galilee. Historically, he's known as Herod Antipas, because there are quite a few Herods around this time. And it's him who had John the Baptist beheaded, albeit reluctantly, after he had said to Herod, "It's not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife." And he's tetrarch of Galilee, and he's noted for constructing the capital Tiberias in Galilee, on the shore of Galilee, in honor of his patron Tiberius Caesar, emperor, who became emperor in 14 AD. And Herod's interesting in that he thought that Jesus was John risen from the dead, and feared John, knowing him to be a just man and holy. And so he heard him gladly, we're told. And yet this is just on that map again. That's where that's Tiberias that Herod built. So those are sort of the rulers under Rome. And then we come to the high priests. So in Luke 3 and John 18, we have these two names that come up. We have Annas and Caiaphas being the high priests. And so Annas was appointed as the first high priest in AD 6, according to history, just after the Romans had deposed Archelaus from ruling over Judea. And so he served as high priest for 10 years until AD 15. But he was then deposed by the procurator Valerius Gratus. And so he was removed from the office of high priest, but he still seems to have commanded some respect and held some influence as a high priest. And so he comes up over the course of the trial. The other one is Caiaphas, who was appointed high priest after Annas, his father-in-law, had been removed. And it's so he is the official high priest, and it's him that gave counsel to the Jews. We read in John 18, verse 14, that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Okay, so that's just a quick look at the people involved, and now this is the order of events, just on a broad outline. This is how I've broken up. So first we have Jesus comes before Annas, then Jesus is questioned by Caiaphas, and then tried by the Jewish council under Caiaphas. And so those first three are sort of the Jews and the chief priests having their trial of Jesus. And it then moves to Pilate and then to Herod, and then back to Pilate, who then offers to release Jesus. He scourges Jesus and again seeks to release him, and eventually delivers him to be crucified. So you can sort of think of it as those two halves: first the priests, and then the governors. And for the location of the events, we don't know exactly where a lot of these took place, but I've sort of identified a couple of places which seem to be important. The high priest palace was one of the first places that Jesus was brought, and there's a potential identification of where that was in Jerusalem, not far from the temple there. And then Herod's palace. So this is Herod the Great, not Herod of Galilee. He built a grand palace on the western side of Jerusalem, and it's thought that might be where Pilate was based and tried Jesus. So those are a couple of the key locations. Number 5 is where Jesus is questioned by Herod of Galilee, and that would likely have been in a different location, but we don't know exactly where that was. And so we have Jesus going into the palace of the high priest in John 18:15. They then lead him into their council. So whether that was also within the palace of the high priest or in a different location, I'm not sure. But then they lead Jesus from Caiaphas into the hall of judgment. And so that's what I'm suggesting is in Herod's palace, where they meet Pilate. And if you go to Jerusalem, you can find this palace, which has a possible identification as the high priest's palace of the time. It's in the Vol Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem. It's a large palatial mansion has been excavated, and it contains 4 ritual baths. It's not far from the Temple Mount. So it could have been the high priest's palace. There's also evidence of a conflagration there, which matches what Josephus says in the historical record. So there's reason to think that this could have been the palace of the high priest. It's built on 2 levels, and it has this large central courtyard, which you can see in the centre there. And it was sort of quite lavishly decorated, and you can see the frescoes on the left there. And there's this large reception room here, which had patterned stucco. And so this perhaps gives us an idea of what it was like in the high priest's palace. And so here's a picture I took. I was on the Promised Land Youth Conference. There's Jonathan Bowen, I believe, and he's standing in this large reception room. And I'm taking the photo from this courtyard. And so if this is the high priest's house, this gives us a picture of how Jesus, being questioned inside in the hall, could have looked at Peter, who had been warming himself by the fire outside. And in fact, there's a porch here in between the 2 rooms. Where it's in Mark's account, it says that Peter denied, saying, "I know not, neither understand I what thou sayest." And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew. And it's in Luke, in Luke 22:61, where we read that the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And so that perhaps just helps us to build a picture of what that might have looked like. And we also know that he was warming himself at the fire, and so that could have been in the courtyard. So that's the high priest's palace. Herod's palace. I've just got a picture of a model here. It's quite a large palace standing in the northwest corner of the city of Jerusalem, above the Serpent's Pool, which supplied the palace with water. And it had 3 large towers which protected the palace from the north. And this is what Brother Lane Rittenmeyer has said, that in the courtyard stood a raised platform, the praetorium, where judgments were pronounced. And so this may have been the place where the judgments took place with the people outside, and Pilate and Jesus before them. Okay, so we'll now go through sort of step by step through the events of the trial. So if we start in John 18. We pick up where we left off after last week's class, with the band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees coming with their torches and weapons. And it's here in John 18 where it talks about Jesus being led to Annas first in verse 13, father-in-law to Caiaphas. And he's then led to Caiaphas. And that's in verse 24. Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. And we see here the first question that Jesus is asked. Verse 19, the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? And so we have this response of Jesus. So if we think about the situation coming up to this, we see that what Jesus is saying is absolutely true, that Jesus has been speaking and preaching openly for many years. And what comes out is that the Jewish rulers who have instigated this have done it with the aim of killing Jesus, so that they can remain in power and that the people don't follow him. And so Jesus' first answer here shows that he does not respect the judgment of Annas, knowing that it's all a wicked and self-serving charade. And so Jesus gives this response, and at various points throughout the trial remains silent and refuses to answer their questions. After Jesus said that, in verse 22, that one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Answerest thou the high priest so?" And Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me?" And so that's sort of the initial interaction. But then Jesus is taken before the council, before the chief priests and the elders, who sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. So this is more of a sort of formal trial setting. And what is the accusation that they're going to bring against Jesus? Well, they don't really have one. And so they seek for false witness. But these also fail with the witness not agreeing together. And this is similar to Daniel before he was sent to the lion's den. The princes couldn't find a fault in all that he did, and so instead the priests they're working back from the end they desire, which is Jesus' death, and so they're making up this false witness, and they found none which fulfills Psalm 35 verse 19, where it says, "They hate me without a cause." There was no fault, no accusation that they had to bring. And then Jesus' response in this formal trial is he held his peace and he answered nothing, which fulfills what we have in Isaiah 53, that he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. And when we think about this, what we'll see is that there's various stages and questions and trials, and Jesus is not always silent throughout the trials. There are some instances where he gives answers to people, but when he's questioned before this Jewish council, he gives no answer. Why? Well, I think there's multiple reasons. He was fulfilling that picture of the lamb to the slaughter prophesied in Isaiah 53. But another reason is that he knew that the judgment of the priests was wicked and dishonest and self-serving. And so Jesus didn't seek to be justified in their sight. There was no value to it. But instead, he committed himself to God's righteous judgment. And so he was not seeking to be released, but to fulfill his Father's will and to give his life in obedience. Which is what we find in 1 Peter 2, verse 23, that Jesus, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. So he gave his life in obedience and looked to God's righteous judgment, which was to raise him from the dead to glory. And so the chief priests and the Pharisees have a problem. They've not got an accusation, and their witnesses aren't agreeing. And so they resort to forcing Jesus to speak. The high priest said to him in Matthew 26:63, I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. The word adjure there means to command under an oath, exorcizo. And so in response to this, Jesus does speak. He says, thou hast said, which isn't an ambiguous answer. It's emphatic. And in Mark's record, we find that Jesus said, I am. So Mark's 14:62, Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. So Jesus confesses that he is the Christ, the Son of God. And the high priest's response is sort of very dramatic. He rends his clothes, saying, he hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witness? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, he is guilty of death. And so very quickly we have a charge, a verdict, and a sentence. And they're all, of course, unjustified. And in the process of this this verdict, the high priest rends his clothes, which breaks the law. In Leviticus, it says that the high priest shall not uncover his head nor rend his clothes. And in Exodus 28, verse 32, it says that his blue robe was designed to never be rent. It was woven work round about the whole of it, as it were the whole of an habergeon, that it should not be rent. And then we can compare this to Jesus' coat, which was not rent. In John 19, verse 24, when the soldiers took Jesus' garments, they said, let us not rend it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be. And perhaps so in that picture of the two garments, we have sort of an allegory for the holiness and the righteousness of these two men. We have the man who's supposed to be the high priest, who's meant to demonstrate holiness, but was going about using deceit, wrath, and violence, motivated by envy, to kill God's beloved Son. And in front of him, Jesus stands as the true high priest, in whom was no guile, and all of his actions were out of a pure devotion to God. So there's this enormous contrast between the man with the title of high priest and the true high priest. And so they, after announcing this verdict and sentence, they spat in Jesus' face and buffeted him. Others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? And this again fulfills prophecies from Isaiah. Isaiah 50, verse 6, I gave my back to the smiters and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. So Jesus is now physically abused and struck by the Jewish leaders. And this is the first but not the last example of an unbridled violent ordeal during the trial. And we remember that throughout all this, Jesus had the power to command legions of angels, but he was firm in his faith and in his commitment to obedience to the Father. And we see his mindset in the rest of that quote from Isaiah, which says, for the Lord Yahweh will help me, therefore shall I not be confounded. Therefore have I set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be ashamed. And so that really concludes the section where where Jesus is tried by the Jews. They've got their sentence, and they take Jesus to Pilate. So we move to number 4, and to Herod's palace. And so when the morning was come, they took counsel against Jesus to put him to death, and led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. And it says that they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And this is sort of quite an extraordinary thing to think that they're concerned about being defiled when they're in the middle of such a wicked action, and it fulfills what Jesus had said in Matthew 23 about them tithing mint and anise and cumin, but omitting the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. And here they omitted all judgment in their condemnation of a righteous man. And so we come then to Pilate. There's this quite interesting exchange that happens. Pilate says, "What accusation bring ye against this man?" They answer and say, "If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee." And it's interesting because the priests don't appear to want to provide any justification for what they're doing. And it perhaps implies they thought Jesus would just do as they asked, wanting to keep the peace. It's interesting that the wording in John implies that Pilate spoke alone to Jesus before speaking to the Jews, because it says that Pilate went out unto them and said, "What accusation bring you?" So perhaps Pilate had spoken to Jesus and they'd had some discussion. But Pilate would have already heard that this man that they were bringing was extraordinary. Earlier in John 18, we had this military band of men that went out to arrest Jesus, and the Romans and Pilate would have been involved with the Jews in order to arrest him. But the soldiers that had gone there must have reported back to Pilate that they'd been knocked backwards by an unarmed man, and that they'd witnessed an ear being cut off and then healed. And so Pilate began to realize that this was not an ordinary case, and apparently questioned Jesus alone. And although this initial private exchange is not recorded, we know that Jesus' authority was always apparent when he was teaching. And so Pilate was not immune to this also. And so Pilate then takes up a stance of resisting the Jews' plans. Pilate says, "Take ye him and judge him according to your law." So they'll not provide an accusation. Why don't they judge him themselves? But the Jews said unto him, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." So this is why the Jews had come to Pilate. Only the Romans were able to inflict capital punishment in the province. And it had to be this way to fulfill what Jesus had said, signifying what death he should die. In John 3 verse 14 and John 12 verse 32, Jesus had said that the Son of Man shall be lifted up, signifying the death that he should die. And so in John 18 verse 33, then we come to Pilate again. He seems to have gone out to the Jews, had this exchange, and then gone back into the judgment hall to Jesus and speaks to him. And this time we have recorded what was said. Pilate asks, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me?" Pilate's sort of taken aback by that response. "Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done?" And Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. And I think what Jesus is teaching Pilate is that the work that Jesus is doing is much greater than some isolated temporary political dispute in one Roman province. And what Pilate starts to get a sense of is that he's standing before the King of the whole earth, appointed by God, and that this is much bigger than anything that Pilate has come across. He says, "Art thou a king then?" And this seems to be always a recurring theme amongst what Pilate says. He's always talking about kingship. Art thou a king? And again, this is an emphatic answer from Jesus. Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. And so Jesus says that he is a king, but he's not here to reign, but to witness to the truth. And Pilate is confused. And again, he senses this man is special, he's extraordinary, and sees his innocence. He says, "What is truth?" And then gives his verdict. "I find in him no fault at all." So this is the first verdict we have from Pilate, and it won't be the last. So, of course, the priests aren't happy with this verdict, and so they begin to accuse him. Rather than just a discussion between Pilate and Jesus, we have a prosecution by the priests, where they say, "We found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king." And Jesus, again in this case, answers nothing. And you can see how the focus of the accusations of the priests has changed. It's no longer about blasphemy. It's about whether this man is a troublemaker and an enemy of Caesar, as they try to bring Pilate back on side. But as Pilate watches and sees Jesus answer nothing, he becomes more in awe of Jesus. "Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee?" And Jesus again answers him to never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. And then Pilate asks himself, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And this time Jesus answers, "Thou sayest it." And nothing that Pilate has seen has changed his mind. "I find no fault in this man." And the priests become more fierce. "He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." And then Pilate picks up on this. He knows that Galilee is Herod's jurisdiction. And so this perhaps is a way out for him. He doesn't have to deal with this conflict. He can send Jesus to Herod, who was also at Jerusalem. And there's just a reminder that Galilee is Herod's jurisdiction, and you can see Nazareth, where Jesus is from, in that area. And so Herod was exceeding glad to see Jesus. He had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen a miracle done by him. And so in Herod, we again have someone who's not out to get Jesus, but he hopes to see a miracle done by him. And so, as I say, I don't know exactly where this took place, but it would have been another palace or house where Herod was staying in Jerusalem. And so this exchange with Herod is only found in Luke's gospel. And Herod seems to be, like Pilate, curious and willing to listen to Jesus. But Jesus doesn't have a discussion with Herod like he does with Pilate. Herod questions him and Jesus answers nothing. And so why does Jesus apparently treat Herod differently? Well, perhaps it's got something to do with the sort of man Herod was. He had killed John the Baptist, and Luke 13 says that he'd sought Jesus' life. Luke 13:31, the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Get thee out and depart hence, for Herod will kill thee." And that's where Jesus refers to him as a fox. And perhaps it's similar to when the scribes and Pharisees came to Jesus, and they were looking for a sign from him. But he answered and said unto them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas." So that's Matthew 12, verse 38 to 39. And perhaps Herod exemplifies this evil and adulterous generation seeking a sign after he went after John after he took his brother Philip's wife and married her. So Jesus gave no answer, and then the chief priests and scribes vehemently accused him before Herod. Herod then mocks Jesus, but does not proclaim a verdict, and instead returns Jesus to Pilate. And Pilate, in fact, proclaims in verse 15 of Luke 23 that that Herod found no fault in him. And so though we don't have a verdict here, and though Herod mistreats and mocks Jesus, he doesn't appear to find fault in him, and they're made friends. So Jesus is then returned to Pilate, to Herod's palace, where Pilate offers to release Jesus. And we're sort of coming to the final part of the trial now, where where we have Pilate. He's decided that he wants to release Jesus. And one thing that we start to see is how powerless Pilate seems. He's meant to be the man in charge, the governor and representative of the power of Rome in Jerusalem, but he can't seem to release Jesus as he would. So he says here, "I've examined him, I found no fault in him, no, nor yet Herod. Nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him and release him." And another thing to notice here is there's now a new group of people with the chief priests and rulers. There's the people. And so Pilate is perhaps more outnumbered than before, and it starts to be afraid of riotous disorder that it's his job to prevent. And so Pilate seeks a convenient way out. He appeals to the people's sense of justice and to Jesus' popularity, and says, I want to release unto the people a prisoner. Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. And so he's resisting the chief priests. And it's at this point that in Matthew's record we're told that his wife had said unto him, saying, "Have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him." And so that gives more reason and more support to Pilate's sense of the import that he should not be involved in this wicked scheme to kill Jesus. But again, Pilate's solution doesn't work. The chief priests and elders persuade the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. And Pilate says to them, "What shall I do with Jesus?" They say, "Let him be crucified." The governor said, Why, what evil hath he done?" They cried the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." And so Pilate despairs to find the multitude have turned against Jesus, and he is alone in seeking his release, and the multitude are completely unreasonable, but seeking only Jesus' death. And so Pilate begins to despair here, seeing he can't prevail, but a tumult was made. And so he washes his hands before the multitude, saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this just person, see ye to it. And again, this isn't really a solution, because in the end, he is the one with authority over who is taken to be killed. But the people are willing to take on the responsibility. His blood be on us and on our children, they say. So it's then really in John 19 that we get the full details of this last section. Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. This fits with the conclusion that Pilate gave earlier. He said, I will chastise him and release him. And so this seems to be an attempt at a compromise to scourge Jesus and then to release him. And then we have the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe and said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they smote him with their hands. Pilate therefore went forth again and said unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. The Pilate is still in the same state and with the same opinion. Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said unto them, Behold the man. And so it's unclear, I think, whether it's Pilate who said, Behold the man, or whether it's Jesus himself. It's possible that it was Jesus, perhaps quoting from Zechariah 6, verse 12. Thus speaketh Yahweh of hosts, saying, Behold the man whose name is the branch, and he shall grow up out of his place, and shall build the temple of Yahweh. Even he shall build the temple of Yahweh, and he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule upon his throne. And he shall be a priest upon his throne. The counsel of peace shall be between them both. But if it was Pilate who said it, he is perhaps appealing to the multitude to say, I've scourged him, behold him. It's enough. I want to release him. But when the chief priests do behold him, they cry out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said unto them, Take ye him and crucify him. I find no fault in him. It was still stuck in the same place. The Jews answered, We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. And when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. So this is perhaps the first time he has heard that stated, that this is the Son of God. It's again adds to the intensity of his fear of what he's going through, and the enormity of what he's about to do. And so Pilate again goes to speak to Jesus. He asks Jesus, Whence art thou? I think try to explore, is this the Son of God? But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate says again, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee, and have power to release thee? But Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. And so Jesus, speaking about power given from above, is really answering Pilate's question, that he is the Son of God. His Father is in heaven, and it's God who is all-powerful, who sets up kings and cannot be withstood. And Pilate is experiencing this in his impotence against the chief priests. And of course, the truth is that Jesus is the chosen king in Jerusalem, and here is obedient to his Father's will. And so Pilate again sought to release him in John 19:12. But then the Jews talk about Caesar. If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. And when he heard that saying, he sat down in judgment and said to the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried to him, Crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, Shall I crucify your king? So again, Pilate is repeating about Jesus being their king. But the chief priests answer, We have no king but Caesar. And it's there that Pilate gives up. He capitulates. Pilate was compromised by his fear of Caesar and of the Jews, and was therefore powerless to resist them. He had been convinced by Jesus that he was the king of the Jews, and sought to have nothing to do with that just man. But in the end he capitulated and delivered him to be crucified. And so they delivered him to be crucified and led him away. But Pilate was stubborn in one thing. He insisted that the inscription would read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And I just finished with this last thought. We saw earlier how Jesus, the high priest, was stood before a man with the title of the high priest, and there was this enormous contrast between them. I think we have a similar thing with Jesus and with Pilate. Pilate was the political power in Jerusalem. He was in charge of the army and was the ruler. And if we take this verse from 2 Samuel 23, verse 3, the God of Israel said, The rock of Israel spake to me, He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And we again see a contrast, this time between Pilate and Jesus. Pilate was not just. He was unjust to scourge Jesus, and he was unjust to deliver him to be crucified. And he did not fear God, he rather feared Caesar and the people. And standing opposite him, wearing that crown of thorns, was God's chosen ruler, who was and is righteous, and acted throughout the trial, always in the fear of God and fulfilling God's will. Thank you.